seconds from here.
Tell me when.
The picture comes on, you'll be good to go.
Okay, we're ready to go. Order, order. Can I welcome our witnesses to our first panel of the afternoon on our work that we've been doing on the policing response to the disorder we saw last summer following the dreadful, horrendous incident in Southport. Maybe the witnesses would like to introduce themselves and then we can go into questioning. So perhaps we start with you.
Good afternoon, Chair. I'm Matt Twist, Assistant Commissioner for Frontline Policing in the Met. For the purpose, last year I was Assistant Commissioner for Met Operations with strategic lead for disorder and protest.
Yeah, good afternoon. Ben Julian Harrington, Chief Constable of Essex, and last summer I was the National Coordinating Goals for the National Police Chiefs Council.
Serena Kennedy, Chief Constable of Merseyside, which covers the Southport area.
Emily Spurrell, I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for Merseyside, which covers Southport, but also the Chair of the Association of PCCs.
Thank you very much. So if we can start off, and it's a question specifically to you, Chief Constable Kennedy, which is about the decisions you took. So you believed at the time that the organised far right was responsible for the Southport disorder. Is that still your assessment? And was that different to the disorder that you saw in Liverpool itself?
So what we saw, obviously, as you've already mentioned, Chair, was the tragic events of the 29th of July, and our thoughts are always with the families and the victims. What we saw on the 30th was a community in shock, grieving and wanting to come together. So working with partners, there was an organised vigil which took place on the evening of the 30th of July. We were also monitoring a number of social media feeds and intelligence coming in that there was commentary around the person who was responsible or that was in custody for those murders. Some of those chats, some of the social media chats that were taking place were on what we would associate with far right social media channels. So in terms of your question, would I say that the protest was linked to the far right? I think what we can say is the information around calling people to attend at Southport, although I would say on that day, on the 30th of July, there was 10 different locations and dates of people suggesting that they came together. So it's not as simple as saying everybody was called to go to Southport on the evening of the 30th. But that information was being passed through some far-right channels, as well as other channels as well, and also some channels that we didn't have access to. But there was definitely an element of far-right to it.
And that was Southport itself. What about Liverpool?
So in terms of Liverpool, which took place on the following Saturday, there was two clear groupings that we would associate with what we would suggest was a left-wing protest, a counter-protest in terms of, and then a right-wing group involved in initially what I would suggest was peaceful protest.
Did you receive mutual aid? What mutual aid did the force receive at the time of the initial disturbances in Southport and then the further miles across Merseyside?
So if I can take you back to the events of the 30th of July, we were planning for a community event. As I say, this was a community that was grieving. They wanted to come together. They wanted fellowship. They wanted solidarity as a community. And they wanted to show their respect to three little girls who lost their lives and show their family what that had meant to Southport. So we saw about 1,000 people come together to attend that vigil. And as I say, there was some chatter, some intelligence, some information about people being called to attend at Southport across 4 different locations, 10 different locations in total, and 3 different dates were being given. However, so we were planning for a community event. Officers were addressed appropriately to police what was a community event. Whilst the vigil was taking place, we did see some people within that vigil, approximately 70 people, who I would suggest were clearly not there for the vigil. The vigil ended and those 70 people, approximately 70 people, left that vigil and grouped outside of Southport Town Hall. and they moved up towards the mosque at 1940. And the officers on the ground did a brilliant job. They quickly realised as this group left the town hall where they were heading for, and they were heading for the mosque. So the officers did a brilliant job getting a line around the mosque, because we knew there was people in the mosque to protect them. Within 7 minutes of arriving at that location, the first acts of violence and criminal damage took place. And therefore we had to mobilise the officers that we'd had on standby to support the community event in the vigil. That situation very quickly escalated, as I say, 7 minutes from those people arriving at the mosque. Absolutely intent, in my view, on getting inside the mosque, injuring the people inside it, and also committing acts of criminal damage. So we then called for mutual aid, and we were really well supported from forces across the northwest. So we went through our normal coordination channels through the RIC, which is owned for the region by Greater Manchester Police, and we had officers very, very quickly from right across the 6 northwest forces, including ourselves. But actually we had officers who were mobilising from West Midlands as well.
Thank you very much. We're going to go on to some more questions around the suspect. Joni Reid.
Yeah, thank you. Chief Constable Kennedy, I just want to, as the Chair said, move on to information about the suspect and how that was communicated. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, did you receive clear guidance and advice from the CPS about the communications of the man that you had in custody?
So we've worked really closely with the Crown Prosecution Service right from the 29th of July. We released, as we would, in line with what we would always say, the age of the person that was in custody, the area that they were from. We wouldn't release an address at that point, and also where they'd been arrested. So that information was released by Merseyside Police without consultation with the Crown Prosecution Service. That is standard practice in terms of what we would release. Clearly, some of the disinformation that was out there on the 29th of July, that the person we had in custody was an asylum seeker. So on my first press release on the evening of Monday the 29th of July, we knew that the suspect at that time had moved to the northwest from Cardiff, but what we didn't know was whether he was born in Cardiff or not. So at my first press release, I said that he was originally from Cardiff, but within several hours of doing that press conference, we knew that he'd been born in Cardiff. So my statement was updated to say that he was born in Cardiff. And again, that was not done in consultation with the CPS. That was standard information that we would always release when someone is arrested. We worked really closely during that 48 hours, obviously, as we carried on with the investigation to get to the point of charge. And on the evening of the 31st of July, we had some detailed conversations with the Deputy Branch Crown Prosecutor and their local lead for CPS. By that time, we'd obviously had the disorder in Southport, and we'd seen, I think, 3 other cities experiencing disorder. And I wanted to try and give as much information as I could during the press conference that we were going to do around the charges, to help my colleagues around the country to try and deal with some of the misinformation and the disinformation. So we communicated, I think the first email went into National CPS at 4:43 around the suggestion that we do a joint press conference. The response back from National CPS was around being mindful of what we release in terms of information about the suspect, bearing in mind contempt. We sent over a copy of what we wanted to put out in terms of a press release, which included the religion of the suspect and the religion of the suspect's parents. We sent that over to CPS at about 9:30 at night, letting them know that we were doing the press conference somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight. The Deputy Branch Crown Prosecutor attended at Merseyside Police Headquarters with their head of local comms, and we had about a 90-minute discussion all around the use of the wanting to put the religion in the statement, and I explained why. And I won't say my exact wording, but it will have been along the lines of, I need to help my colleagues out, my fellow chief constables. The streets of some of the streets of the UK are on fire, and I need to help them as much as I can. But there was real concerns around me putting the religion into my press statement. And it was very, very clear within that 90-minute conversation that the Crown Prosecution Service locally were very unhappy at our suggestion of including that. So based on that advice, we didn't include the suspect's religion in my press statement that I did at about midnight that evening, and we didn't include it in the press release that went out. I'm subsequently aware that National CPS did email back into our Merseyside Police's comms team at 11:30 to say that they were happy for us to include the religion, but by that time we were downstairs and we were preparing for the press conference, so that actually wasn't seen by ourselves. However, what I will say is that came from the National Comms team, and I was taking my direction from the Deputy Branch Crown Prosecutor, who was very clear that I couldn't include that in my press release, which is why that wasn't included.
Thank you. That's very clear and thorough. Thank you very much. So just to clarify, you feel that there wasn't a consistent approach from both the local CPS and national CPS?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Was there a consistent advice and an approach from at a local level and a national level? What you're saying is that there was not, and in fact there was conflicting advice.
There was a 90-minute conversation which took place in the conference room at Merseyside Police with three of my colleagues, the Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor for Cheshire Mersey and their local comms team, and they weren't cited on the fact that none of us were cited on the fact that at 11:30 an email arrived from the national comms team. But I would suggest that the difference between what the national comms team said, I was taking my from the Deputy Chief Branch Crown Prosecutor, who was in the building with me, who was very, very clear that her priority was around justice. And I've said right from the start, my priority has been that we followed a family-focused approach and we actually get justice for the families of the three little girls and the victims and their families. And right throughout, I have not wanted to do anything that would compromise that justice.
Following that, you've said subsequently that ideally you would have liked to have released more information about the Southport murders. Were you thinking specifically about the publication of the religion of the suspect?
So initially I wanted to give that information because obviously there was disinformation out there around, and we saw our Muslim communities across the country being subjected to hate crimes. Alone in Merseyside, we would normally get in that period about 130 hate crimes in that week. We saw that shift up to about 170, and we know the impact it had both locally on our Muslim communities and nationally. And I wanted to be able to get out that point that at that time, there was no suggestion that the suspect in custody was from that Muslim faith, but I was unable to say that at that time.
Was there any other information that you would have liked to have shared that you were unable to share based on advice from the local
As I say,
CPS?
we've worked really closely right from the 29th of July with our colleagues from the Crown Prosecution Service, both locally and nationally, in terms of making sure that any statements, any publications, any planning for subsequent charges in October, planning for the trial, planning once we got the guilty plea, and then planning for the sentencing. We've worked really closely to make sure that everybody is comfortable that we are following a family-focused approach, so the families hear the information first, and that we've worked really well collaboratively to support support the families, but also to make sure that we were giving as much information as possible to the public without compromising the trial.
So after the incident that you spoke about where there was a miscommunication and you didn't receive the information from the national CPS, were you then, was that a turning point in terms of the relationship with the national organisation, and were you then able to have a direct line of communication so you would have clear guidance and advice on the information that you did then subsequently publish?
Yeah, so in terms of October and January, there was joint meetings with national CPS comms teams, regional CPS and regional comms teams, and ourselves, and counter-terrorism right throughout.
And my final question to you is, do you think, and it's asking you to speculate, but in your professional opinion, do you think being able to share more information about the suspect on the 29th of July in the way in which you couldn't may have prevented disorder from escalating?
I would suggest it's really difficult to say that. I think what I've already said is, we knew some of the disinformation that was out there about the suspect's religion, and that was having an impact on our Muslim communities, and I wanted to try and dispel that disinformation that was out there. I think it's really difficult to say, would it have stopped the disorder? I don't think I can answer that. I think what I would say is, and I think the DPP says it himself in terms of the media protocol that we've got in place is 19 years old. And, in terms of where we are, in terms of social media channels, the use of social media, we know during that time there was about 900,000 users using Telegram. Telegram wasn't even a thing back 19 years ago. I think this case really highlights why we need to look at how we handle releases of information to the public, whilst also making sure that we don't impact on the criminal justice trial.
Davis.
Just a very quick question in regards to the ultimate decision. I accept that the CPS gave you advice, but it was your decision ultimately. What was the consideration given in terms of overriding the decision made by the local CPS? Was that in fear of the contempt proceedings, and therefore was it effectively more of a direction from the local CPS that you felt that you received rather than advice, just the word that you used earlier?
I think it was very clear. The language used was, I was asked, why are we straying from what we would normally issue? Because when we normally issue a charging statement, it's unusual to do a press conference, and it's normally very formulaic in what we would say. So the view of the Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor was asking me, why are we straying away from what we are normally saying? And that is when I replayed back, because of this is a unique situation in terms of what my colleagues around the country were dealing with. So yes, it was my decision to take it out of the press release, but to me it was very clear that it was unclear in terms of how the investigation was going to proceed. It was 48 hours in, and therefore there was a very clear view from CPS that I shouldn't be including the religion because of the impact on the criminal justice process.
Just to push you slightly too, well, this is pre-charge.
Yeah.
So in terms of the decision around the public saying where the suspect was born, even not just lived, or where he's from, but where he was born was also released. Which I don't think is necessarily that standard in a standard press release in this regard to say where the suspect was born. In regards to the advice that you received from the CPS and looking to the future as well, and it's easy to sort of examine things with 2020 hindsight. I accept that. But in terms of going forward, has there been an agreement between the CPS and police nationally around who makes the decision ultimately pre-charge around these press releases and press statements, or is it still unclear?
I mean, what I will say is that we worked with both local comms and national comms for each of the three key points: charging, further charges, and then the trial. And there was very clear views on both sides where red pens were taken to statements. I know the DPP has provided information around Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, but each three of those key points, there was conversations around information that I would class as Category 3, where we had to negotiate and influence and work collaboratively to reach an agreed position, and that definitely meandered throughout each of those 3 points.
Something you just said then, does the media protocol need updating?
In my view, I think it does. It's 19 years old. I don't think it takes account of where we are in terms of the impact of social media, and as we saw it play out in events following Southport. I think it's not just the media protocol that needs updating, and obviously the Law Commission are looking at contempt of court in terms of how do we wrestle with that misinformation, disinformation, balancing the need for a fair trial and making sure there's not contempt of court issues.
And is it being updated, or do you not know?
In terms of the media protocol, that is being worked through now. I think as a result of Southport, National Police Chiefs Council are now working with Crown Prosecution Service and working with government to look at how do we deal with situations like this moving forward.
We're looking in Parliament about what we can say as well, so it has prompted that around.
And just to clarify, sorry, you said a couple of times it was a 90-minute meeting, obviously at a critical and stressful juncture, and just that was a 90-minute meeting just on that one point. It was a 90-minute meeting around the press release, but the specifics of the paragraph that got excluded from what I was going to say at the press conference and that was going to be released afterwards was basically around the religion. Okay, and we can infer from that the length of that meeting that there was a robust exchange of views from both sides. Yes. Okay, all right, that's useful.
When were you aware of the suspect's religion?
I'm afraid I can't remember. Chair.
And did you think about publishing? Did you consider publishing it before it was actually published?
It was going to be published, to say, during when we were going to announce the charges, so it hadn't been a decision for us to make prior to that, which is why, obviously, we were working really closely with our colleagues from CPS.
Margaret Mullane.
Thank you, Chair. Assistant Commissioner Twist, could I ask you to briefly summarise last year's disorder on Whitehall, and could you contrast that with your subsequent policing of the Tommy Robinson supporters protests, which had that disorder missing?
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to, and I'll just clarify which sort of subsequent protest, but I'll touch on Whitehall first, and then because there have been a number, and in the overall timeline, there had actually been a Tommy Robinson protest in March on the 27th of July, which preceded these events, where again we hadn't seen any challenges. So, following events in Southport at 7 p.m. on Tuesday the 30th of July, we received notification in the Met that there was going to be a protest by a group called Enough is Enough, who ostensibly stated they were going to protest at Downing Street for legislation around knife crime. Similar to what Chief Constable Kennedy said, we saw some of the same patterns in terms of right-wing groups and sort of chat that indicated that was where it would be. And as a result of the information we had and the events that we had seen, Section 14 preconditions under the Public Order Act were authorised to restrict that protest to a defined area within Whitehall. So on the night itself, our estimate was, and the sort of organised estimate was, that they would get somewhere between 500 and 1,000 attendees. We think the number was at the upper range of that. We can't be specific on the total number. And actions from the Met were, and again this is where one of the benefits of being able to act at scale, where we generated 22 PSUs, which is a PSU is our sort of how we group together public order trained officers, which is somewhere of the magnitude of 550 officers to police that protest. Originally, 7 of them were deployed into central London. 7 of the sort of 22, 7 were in Whitehall. 12 were deployed across quadrants of the Met, so northeast, southeast, southwest and northwest, and we had a further 5 on reserve. as a result of what we saw, within a short matter of time, all 22 were deployed into Whitehall. In terms of the event, the group formed up as expected in the conditioned area, which was sort of directly opposite, which is colleagues and members will be familiar with it. Very shortly afterwards, the group entered the carriageway, flares were let off, and a cordon was put in place. In a coordinated move, the majority of protesters then sought to breach the conditions that had been imposed and move towards Parliament Square, and public order tactics were then used to prevent them doing so. We did see people throw projectiles at officers, we did see people attempt to breach the police cordons, and over a period of time, order was restored, the group was prevented getting into Parliament Square, and a number of arrests were made. In total, 111 arrests were made, principally for breach of conditions on the night, but also for offences including violent disorder and possession of offensive weapons.
So, with the subsequent protest, you give your kind of recount to us on that, on the Tommy Robinson supporters as kind of deemed as peaceful protests. Would you agree with that? And do you think that you're able to contain them?
It's really hard to categorise a group. What we deal with is we assess each event in terms of threat, harm and risk. All I can say is, in terms of observations, the Tommy Robinson protest that preceded that week on the 27th of July was broadly peaceful and went to plan. It was a march from the Royal Courts of Justice to Trafalgar Square. That night there was serious disorder for a short period of time in Whitehall, and we managed to contain that because we were able to generate mass quickly and stop the group moving out. Subsequent protests, we didn't see. The following Saturday, on the 3rd of the 8th, we mobilised 46 PSUs, that's just over 1,100 officers, to deal with both a Palestinian solidarity campaign call out and also as a contingency for any other protests related to this, and we didn't see any. And then the following Wednesday, so exactly a week after this, there was, again, we were concerned about 15 potential sites, and this is, the committee maybe want to touch further on the information and misinformation, but we saw telegram channels indicating that there would be cultural nationalist protests at sort of 15 sites, most of which was completely fictitious, but as a result led to a reaction from left-wing and anti-right-wing groups, counter-protests, and in the most extreme example led to a mobilisation of nearly 10,000 people in Waltham Forest to counter-protest against a protest that was never going to happen in the first place. So from our point of view, we had to mobilise significant resources, firstly because the actions on Telegram and then the subsequent reposting on social media of information that actually probably had no basis in the first place led to a really significant risk of counter-protest, and with all of the challenges that might bring. And also based on the information and what we had seen elsewhere in the country, where some of these things happened quite spontaneously, we couldn't take the chance of not resourcing it.
And what do you think is the impact of public order policing on the Met more broadly?
So it's been enormous, and I think we have to look at the whole span of time since October of 2023. I would say without any question it is the busiest period of public order demand that the Met has ever faced. The actual chronic demand started in October of 2022 when we started seeing what I'd call strategic and chronic environmental protest that was placing demand on the service every single day, abstracting officers from community policing. Principally that was the JSO phases 1, 2 and 3. That was compounded by both the chronic and very acute protests we saw following the awful events in Israel in October of 2023, and the very large significant protests that we saw as a result of that. So that generated both a demand every day in terms of some of the environmental stuff and some of the pro-Palestinian marches, but also extremely high demand on weekends, as well as the routine run of events in London with 7 Premiership football grounds and the major events that we deal with. The summer, rolling forward to the summer of 2024, by the time we got to this point, public order officers in the Met were pretty exhausted, actually. I mean, we've just had the busiest year with the highest demand that I think we'd ever had. But we're still, and I would say, the Met is a very resilient organisation and our officers are resilient, and we were able to force mobilise quickly both in London and latterly in support of other parts of the country, where we provided 208 officers on mutual aid as we developed into this sort of scenario. So the impact's been significant. I'll leave it there.
Just one small point, if I could, Chair. Do you think that as this all plays out with the public watching it, and obviously it's of great concern, that kind of impacts on your recruitment on the Met?
I don't know. I mean, at the moment, there isn't a problem with recruitment based on the numbers we're trying to get in and the pipeline that we have. So we have a good recruiting position where we are. That isn't a challenge. I think people look at it, and it is hard work, and there is something around how we recognise those officers that volunteer to become public order officers, and that's the first thing, and encourage more volunteers to do it. Over 12 months ago, we started to significantly increase our number of level 2 officers that have the enhanced public order training, because we could see that numbers over time had diminished. Our aspiration is to have around 4,000 that are level 2 public order trained, and we had moved some way to that. So during the course of last summer, and this was as a result of events that started in 2022, so we had uplifted our number of resources. So during the course of last summer, we started to see some of the fruits of that, and also we started to place other officers from different parts of the Met who traditionally wouldn't have done public order or uniformed operations to support uniformed operations which were lower risk. So we had officers ranging from specialist crime to protective security and others turning out in uniform to support the wider sort of Met effort.
Thank you.
Just on that point, are you confident that those specialist officers that have the public order training are being properly deployed and they're not doing the role that another police officer could do and then being asked to sort of up their game and go into policing more difficult situations?
So the officers that are trained to do public order are usually well experienced, have been specially trained, go regularly on refresher training and have the right kit and equipment. And that's both from our full-time level 1 group, territorial support group, and then all of our level 2 officers who form the bulk of our response to higher risk public order operations. For level 3, which is everything else, and that can be everything from sort of ceremonial to changing of the guard to much smaller events where the risk is much lower, we deploy as many of our officers as we can to do that, to share the burden, because where we focus the level 2 officers is on protests where we think the risk is higher, on some football matches where we know the risk is higher. So actually, if we can stop using the higher trained officers on events which carry much lower risk, then that shares the burden.
Thank you. Paul Kohler.
I'd like to explore a more general question about how much the summer riots were a manifestation of a breakdown of trust between the police and the public, or certain sectors of the public. Emily, you've written about or spoken about a crisis of trust in institutions in this context. Do you want to amplify on that a little?
This was part of an interview I did for The Observer last summer, and it was a comment made in relation to a number of institutions. I think the challenge that we had is that we were trying to, or colleagues were trying to explain the criminal justice process and the contempt of court and why certain information, every detail wasn't allowed to be released to the public for the reason of trying to protect the criminal justice process to ultimately get justice for the families. So I think the point I was trying to make was actually we're trying to explain a process to people, but us as institutions, and I think it's not just the police, I think it applies in other criminal justice situations, it applies to politicians, it applies to, councils, because I think people have seen a real, public services are struggling, and we've seen over the last 15 years or so that services are not delivering for the public in the way that they expect them to. And I think that, amongst with some of the high profile scandals that we've had in policing, politics and others, I think has undermined that trust and confidence in those sectors. And so I think when you're trying to go out and explain to the public how decisions are being made, why certain decisions are being taken, why certain information isn't being put in the public domain to protect that process, I think we were coming at it from a point where they didn't trust what we were saying. And so I think my point was we need to try and look at how we rebuild that trust in all of the different sectors, so people know that they're going to get the right service when they want it, and then when we do have to explain to them or make difficult decisions, they understand why that's happening.
And the data backs you up, and particularly deprived communities having less trust in the police. Is that just a factor of deprivation, or is there more to that? Is it the way police deal with those from deprived communities?
The honest answer is I wouldn't know in detail. I think, we know that in lots of deprived communities you're more likely to be a victim of crime, and so obviously then if you haven't then had the right response from the police, which unfortunately we know things don't always go the way they should do, that might be a reason why you then don't have the trust and confidence to call again or to go back to the police when you need them another time. But I think that's true in lots of communities, so it's probably something that we need to do a bit more research to really understand that.
Do any of your colleagues want to have a comment on that?
I'm happy to build on the point on trust. I think the point made that this is an erosion of trust in all public bodies is relevant. I think we see at times malign actors and social media working in a coordinated way to undermine trust and to sow polarisation and discontent. And we see that some of this is based from abroad. We see that some of this is based from sort of individuals. And the thing that we're dealing with today that is sort of different to 10 or even certainly 20 years ago is the pace at which sort of misinformation and disinformation can spread. One of the characteristics that we dealt with in 2011 when we were sort of looking at our response to disorder in London then was how we were behind the curve in terms of some of the disorder was spreading via a very early form of BlackBerry Messenger, whereas now the threats are spreading at a exponentially greater rate, and the disinformation and misinformation is spreading at an exponentially greater rate, which is undermining trust and confidence because people find it difficult to distill what is actually true.
And Chair, if I could add, I think the disinformation element, which has been described by colleagues here, we saw that across the country. That does undermine trust and confidence. But one of the key things around public order policing, as well as the specially trained officers, the community officers, one of the important elements is what we call a bronze engagement role. A specific senior officer whose job is to engage with local communities, independent advisory groups, local stakeholders to try and build that trust and confidence. So we trade on relied, trusted engagement and relationships in peacetime, so to speak, so that when we are in a position, as we saw across the country last summer, that local officers are able to speak to people and say, no, these are the facts of the matter, you trust us, and that's an important part. So when we think about specialist public order tactics and the training we give our commanders in particular, we are very, very strong that the most important public order tactic is actually community engagement and communication with local communities, so they are both feel assured, are assured, and of course then can give us important information to deal with the issues of crime and criminality that take place.
And that underlines the importance of community policing, does it not?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think one of the strengths of our public order model, and I've had the privilege to go to France and see what they do, where they have a dedicated riot squad, and the gendarmerie and the CRS, is all of the officers that we train, whether they're dedicated to public order duties, they're always policing London or Essex or Merseyside, they're drawn from local community policing. Now, of course, that has an abstraction, because when they're not doing that, when they're doing this kind of stuff, they're not policing neighbourhoods. But what it does mean is that when they're in a neighbourhood, they understand that community. They are not there just to make a mess and run away. They're actually there thinking, do you know what, I'm a police officer, Pelian principles. This is about prevention, engagement and discussion. And of course that leads to some of the discussions that you'll have seen about whether officers are in full code, protective equipment, or whether in normal duty. And there is a fine balance for commanders and officers to say, if we can talk our way and engage is a much better, and you see that very often. And to put that in context, there are 800 notified events, either through social media, notified to us, or we came across over that 2-week period. Only 250 took place, and only we would say about 30 of those, important 30, came into a place of disorder. And a lot of that was because of preemptive, proactive engagement with local communities. And as Mr. Twister said, a huge protest that had all the potential to be disorderly because of good engagement and good policing. The same in Southport, and you saw that in many places across the country as well.
Tony, I think you've got a question.
I just wanted to ask you briefly about the role of social media and your approach to dealing with that during this period. As of course a weapon of choice for a range of actors to promote hatred and provoke violence. So could you just give us an overview of how you dealt with the illegal content that you saw online, and if you felt equipped and had the resources at your disposal to deal with that. And secondly, in a second part to that question, has there been any systematic analysis of the way extremists used social media to promote violence and that led to the scenes that we saw on our streets?
Constable Harrington.
Well, yeah, if I can talk from a national perspective first of all, and I mean the first thing around disinformation in social media, I think, you know, we did work with our intelligence partners and with others to make sure we had a good assessment and to utilise and understand what information was there, whether it was telling us things that were useful. And as you've heard from colleagues here, we were told about things that simply didn't happen from social media, they didn't materialise, and we had to react to those things. I think before you look at the use of social media and policing, I think there is a role now, given the way, you know, everybody lives their lives in social media, the influence from other places, that actually this might be a policing threat one day, it might be a health threat another day, it might be a political threat another day. And I think there is something about national security, in my view, that says, well, where are, you know, what's the baseline of this intelligence, this information that's there, this chatter, and then where does it peak, and who's looking at that for us? And if it's a policing issue, a crime issue, then identifying it to the policing sector, so we can say, right, what does that mean, and delve into that. Nationally, we were getting some of that feed. I know there was lots of information locally, but it's so quick and so rapid. And I think one of the things I want to stress is all of the forces across the country were using, through social media analysis, through content monitoring, to identify and try and assess where the threat, the risk and the harm was. But of course, as I showed you from those numbers earlier, many of those events were fictitious, either set to, whether they were intentionally to dupe us, whether they were trying to stir up something that didn't happen. So it's very, very difficult to react to those individual elements around it. But I think the final point I'd make is we do now encourage public order commanders and public order officers and policing to use social media tactically, so that where you do get a piece of information that says someone's going to go somewhere and do something or something bad is happening, how quick are our communications teams in using that to say, no, that's not true, or the facts of the matter are. But that's a very local issue and has to be picked up locally because it moves so quickly you couldn't do that from a national perspective.
I think two things that are very clear to agree with BJ. There's clear evidence that there were click factory sites and bots were driving up traffic aimed at driving polarisation and division. So we saw that. And I think to Chief Constable Harrington's point, some of the good examples where we see officers have used this well is, for example, where you're seeing something on social media that's gathering traction, saying, oh, there's cultural nationalist protest here, or everyone's gathering at the mosque or the hotel or whatever, and I've seen individual officers just take a picture of it and post it back to go, no, there's nobody here. The question is whether we're on the right channels. Do we have the right reach? Do we have the right number of followers to sort of damp this down quite quickly? But it's very stark, and there is analytics available to this that will show that at sort of 1 minute past midnight on a given day, the number of reposts on a thing that is particularly divisive will go up tenfold. But that's because these are being done in an automated way.
Do you feel that capability has to be available to a local level for all 40 plus forces, or is that a national capability that local police forces can tap into, of course being informed at a local level by local officers? I was struck by your comment, Chief Constable Harrington, around the disadvantage of having a national public order capability. Do you apply that to this capability, or could this capability be a national capability that is fed down, so to speak?
I think you've got to look at the different levels. There will be today and this weekend hundreds of events across the country where social media will play an event. Football matches, protests, and probably some kind of nighttime economy disorder that may have that. There's got to be a local need to assess locally, deal with those things locally. They're happening every weekend around, so we need to be able to do that. You can't rely on the centre to do that. Equally, where something of this magnitude happens and it scales up as you do, you have the ability to say, take a global look, and it is a global look, to turn around and say, what are the things that are only available perhaps to some of our security partners or other agencies who can take a broader look, more intrusive look, in order if it becomes a national security issue.
I would absolutely agree in terms of that need for it to have a national capability. I agree with Chief Constable Harrington that we need a local capability, and I've got real confidence in my team in terms of my Force Intelligence Bureau. But I spoke earlier around the number of events that were being posted. 23 likes and 100 people said they were attending. Now, that would normally be a very community-based response by a local PCSO to kind of engage with those people turning up, and we probably wouldn't have expected all 100 to turn up with 23 likes. What we saw on the 30th of July was something very different. As I say, there were 70 hidden within the vigil, and then once they arrived at the mosque, they swelled to over 200 people very quickly. It was organised, it wasn't going through normal channels, and that's where we need to have that national capability.
Thank you.
Around.
Thank you, Chair, and Chief Constable Harrington, if I may. We saw, in response to the summer disorder, I think it's fair to say quite correctly, a desire from the government, in the words of the Home Secretary, for a strong and determined response, and indeed for a swift response. Had the meeting on the 1st of August in Downing Street with police chiefs in response to this order. I wondered if you could comment on how effective you felt that the joint working between the police and the Home Office was during that period, and whether police forces were overall, in your experience, supportive of actions across government to bring swift justice to the perpetrators.
Yeah, thank you. If I can say, the support from government and from the Crown Prosecution Service and from partners was really, really strong. The interest from the Home Office and from ministers was intrusive, but rightly so. It was questioning, but it was supportive. And I have to say, we saw 2 days of disorder on the Tuesday and Wednesday that week, and then the summit took place on the Thursday. And there was no disorder on the Thursday. But the commitment we got from the Prime Minister, from the Home Secretary, from the Justice Minister, and then subsequently from the Crown Prosecution Service, and of course the courts and the court service, to bring swift justice, was there throughout. And of course the local support from communities and community stakeholders was there across the country. What did that allow us to do? Well, as well as the public order officers deployed, the engagement with local communities where people committed offences, and I think there was over 800 arrests by the end of that first weekend. We've made over 1,800 arrests subsequently. And many of those have been brought to justice already, and I think that showed that the system worked very quickly, very fairly. We had people pleading guilty, so the evidence must have been there. They would have been legally advised and to plead accordingly. And of course we saw swift justice because the system came together. And there's no doubt in my mind, and certainly when I talk to colleagues, that it was that swift action, response, engagement and justice supported by the government that brought this to a swift close. I mean, we mobilised 44,000 officer shifts. We mobilised more than the British Army, and I know that from talking to colleagues there, more quickly to deal with this. But we also mobilised communities and, of course, the justice system behind us. And I think that was part of the success, which saw it draw very quickly to a close. And I would say more successfully than 2011, because some of those things came together very well.
And it's good to hear about that strong sense of coordination and working together. And I suppose seeing people involved brought swiftly to justice was also something that, to an earlier point, hopefully will help rebuild trust in policing. Yes.
It was just to make a comment, I suppose, not on the operational response. Obviously, you've had that, but I suppose as PCCs, we're responsible for the funding and the budget around all of this. So I suppose I can't miss the opportunity to say that coordination was impressive, the response was impressive, but it obviously cost a lot of money, and there were assurances from the Home Office around helping to cover the cost of that, and we're still kind of waiting for the detail in terms of exactly how much we'll get back from that. So just to highlight that work was done, and it was done quickly for exactly the reasons that have been outlined, but it did come at a cost, which we're still working through as police forces and PCCs.
Okay, thank you. That's useful to know. Just to go back to some of the points you made, Chief Constable Harrington, you talked about intrusion, I think was the word you used, and I just wanted to pick up on that because, as the Home Secretary herself has said, as we all agree, obviously, our operational independence is a fundamental principle of British policing, and quite rightly so. But you feel that that intrusion and the direction, the signalling and direction from the government, you feel that was appropriate, both in terms of its level, timing, and how it played out in reality?
Absolutely. I'm not just saying that because of the present company. It was absolutely importantly questioning of Gavin Stevens as the National Police Chiefs Council Chair, myself as the National Coordinating Gold, but also respectful of that operational independence. In the same way I wasn't in operational charge of 43 police force responses, had a coordinating role. I was challenging to the local gold commanders to say how much, how many, how far, what do you need, what challenges have you got, and without taking the operational command from them in the same way. I think the Home Secretary and the Home Office were asking the same questions of me in order to make sure, one, they could trust the response, and that's the responsibility of any government in mind, and I'm happy to answer those questions. Secondly, to provide the support for those responses and to make sure we were getting the support from other government departments and stakeholders, and we did. I think, Emily's point around the money, the letter of comfort was useful because, I speak for a force that, that has had some budget challenges recently, and didn't have disorder. These were significant costs to mobilise officers on rest days, overtime. The total bill was £28.5 million. That's £28.5 million that wouldn't be spent on policing locally, and of course chief constables, commissioners, police and crime commissioners and mayors will be asking where's that money coming from my local community. But of course I think the letter of comfort was really, really important to allow us to say, well, the government, for want of a better description, had our back whilst we were trying to restore order and keep order where disorder hadn't taken place.
Thank you. It's good to hear you feel that there was an appropriate balance in terms of questioning and direction, whilst at the same time maintaining operational independence. Thank you. Just to turn to you, Emily, if I may, I just wondered whether you could comment perhaps on the role that police crime commissioners played at that time, at that juncture, and since, and whether there's anything perhaps that the government could learn from how police crime commissioners work in partnership with forces to inform that joint working between police and government and maintaining that balance in the future.
Yes, absolutely. So obviously as PCCs, a fundamental part of our role is that scrutiny, is that oversight, sometimes referred to as being a critical friend. We want to support and endorse, not interfere with operational independence. It's absolutely right that chiefs can direct their resources to where they think they need to go. But I think the importance of the PCC role is to provide that transparency and make sure that the public can be reassured that, those resources are being done in a responsible way. We've worked very closely with Home Office. We worked closely with HMIC, who obviously did an inspection to look at how different forces had responded, and we pull out lots of the themes that have come out of that, and that will be fed into the various scrutiny programmes that PCCs and deputy mayors will have with their chief constables. So I suppose in terms of the immediacy, there was obviously some robust conversation between PCCs and deputy mayors with their chiefs where the disorder was happening, trying to understand what was being done to get control of the situation. Since then, there is now a very proactive conversation for all PCCs and deputy mayors to say to chiefs, well, actually, are you prepared now? Have you learned the lessons? What do you know now that you didn't know before? And how do we make sure that, touch wood, nothing like this does happen again? But if it does, how are you going to prepare for it in the future? So it's about making sure that, that transparency, that accountability is there. And as I say, we work closely with people like HMIC to pull some of that learning into that.
That's very useful. I'm very happy.
On the political response, what is your response to the accusations of two-tier policing?
Well, if I can start off, policing and police officers every day put themselves in between two people who have different views and opinions, whether it's on a Saturday night outside a pub where someone's drunk too much, or whether it's at a football match this weekend, or indeed where you see some of the protests we've seen. I mean, the first point I think to point out is, a lot of this has been discussed as protests, and I think all colleagues here, and certainly chiefs across the country, would say that what we saw in many of these places was simply not protests. You've heard what Serena said, 7 minutes till the first violence took place. They're not protests. Where people are coming together to express different views, we operate within the legal framework that is given, the Public Order Act, and there's lots of people who like parts of it and don't like parts of it, but in policing we're accountable to the law first and foremost, and police within that framework. So of course we have to balance those views, and where that's about sign or a visible representation, to quote some of the law, then we have to make that balanced judgment to say what it is, and it's difficult. And people will have very emotive or very fixed emotions about what those means. It's complex and sometimes very difficult, and judgments being made on a very small piece of information where someone perhaps on a television screen sees the whole picture, or indeed through a very small screen sees only part of the picture, and then judges the outcome or the decisions an officer or a commander has to make. So that's the first point. I think that can be appeared to say, why has the officer made that decision? They do that within the legal framework. What does the law say? Not what do people think, what do they want it to say, but what does the law say? And then, of course, what we saw here, and when we see violence, when somebody throws a punch, throws a bottle, tries to smash up a mosque or a community centre or a citizen, that's not protest, that's violence, and it's very simple. When that happens, it's really easy for officers. Not, and you saw some amazing bravery, didn't you, from commanders and from our colleagues who I'm really proud to say went forward. That's easy for them to say that's not protest, that's not two-tier policing. But of course, where there is nuance, where there is difference of opinion, where there's emotion, that's going to be difficult. And the officers have to deal with the information that's available to them, the evidence is there, and importantly, they have to deal with the law as it stands.
Thanks, Chair. I worry that we hear a lot about two-tier policing, and I worry that it's become a bit of a catchphrase for people who want to criticise without meaningfully engaging with the substance of the debate. As Chief Constable Harrington said, we police without fear or favour to the law as it is, not as others might wish it to be. And one of the common characteristics of policing protest is you have protest and counter-protest, and almost inevitably one group will think you've gone too far and the other group will think you haven't done enough. And that's certainly been sort of consistent in terms of some of the stuff that I've been dealing with in London over the past 3 years. I think what's important to note is we have to assess each incident, protest or event based on the threat, harm and risk, and provide a proportionate policing response. And the response will differ based on the threat and harm and the law and what policy requires. So there's a million tiers of policing, as there should be, because we need to deal with each thing on its merits. And I do worry it's become a bit of a catchphrase. I've had it shouted at me at different points in the most bizarre circumstances. So I don't agree that it's a thing. I suppose what I would draw attention to is something that Sir Tom Windsor said to a version of this committee last year, where he described in Policing and a Protest report in February of 24 that public order policing he considered to be the brain surgery of policing because it is so complicated. There are so many different views, it's so hard to get it right, and I think it's almost impossible to please everybody.
Around, and then we've got a couple more questions after that, if you're okay for just a few minutes longer.
Very quickly, sorry. And thank you for that really eloquent explanation of some of the complexities, Assistant Commissioner. Do you think the police make that explanation as much as perhaps it could be made, and state that as much as it could be stated, including to local communities?
I think we try, and particularly in circumstances where we've got communities, for example, the Jewish community in London, who've been particularly fearful as a result of a number of protest activities. We do it in person, we do it in terms of our online media presence, in terms of our actions on the ground and how we engage. But as we've already heard in this committee, at times you're operating against a barrage of sort of social media and automation within that is trying your very best to drown it out. And of course, the clicks that are generated from a wild allegation of two-tier policing based on a snapshot of a very tiny subset of one incident, as Chief Constable Harrington's described, is much more newsworthy than maybe the measured, sort of considered view of someone who's got all of the facts. So we do try, and I don't think we'll ever fully achieve it, but we will continue trying because I think it's really important to try and get the facts out there.
Margaret Mullane.
Thank you. Chief Constable Harrington, would you agree with the government's view that the policing response to the summer disorder highlighted weaknesses in national policing structures?
Well, first of all, I think, as a result of colleagues and work they went forward very bravely and restored order very quickly. We saw whether it's in Southport, whether it's in Cleveland, in arrests made, people brought to justice and communities protected. So on that response, I'm very proud, and I think it was an effective response. hindsight is an amazing thing. The retrospectoscope is a very precise tool, as a medical colleague told me. And so I think it's easy to join the dots now and say we should have done more quickly. And of course, as the National Coordinating Gold, had I known what I know now, I would have mobilised more quickly. But I think the response was strong. We, the response, as I said, across the community and across law enforcement and with government was strong. We've made 1,800 arrests. We mobilised probably the biggest mobilisation of officers that we have seen across communities. We saw lots of events take place without disorder, and we've seen some criminals put in prison for a long time as a result of the damage they've caused to the communities in which they live. So I think the response was good. However, like anything, like the report says, there are things we could learn. How do we deal with social media? We've discussed that in this committee today. I think we've got to modernise that and ensure we're as fit for purpose as we should be in the 21st century. We've reviewed our tactics, and I think the evidence I've got from the debriefs is they were largely effective, but there was still stuff to do. And there's an important element that we need to make sure we maintain our training and learn from what happens, because we spent a lot of time policing what I call protest policing, peacekeeping, where we are, that brain surgery as Matt describes, and then all of a sudden we're flung into what I call war fighting, where people are throwing bricks and bottles, and we have to make sure that our officers were inexperienced in that. So how do we give them the knowledge and the experience to be able to switch as quickly as perhaps a violent crowd does, and our commanders as well? And we have to make sure that we understand the impact on them, and I think the welfare is really important. So there's lots of come out of the inspector's report. We're working through that. We appreciate the praise they gave us as a service for the way we responded, and of course the officers who did the very brave and hard work, which was to protect the communities. But of course we will learn from those things. We're already looking at the recommendations from that report, and I know through my National Operations Committee we are starting to implement and look at those to make sure that we learn every lesson and perfect what I think was an effective response.
Thank you. My final question was, we had the Home Secretary at one of our committees, and she was talking through with us about procurement and IT and, what would be more beneficial to help police forces. I just wondered what your thoughts are.
Oh, that's a very big question beyond public order. I think, if I come back to dealing with this, there is something about how do we formalise our national response to incidents of national security, which this was, wasn't it? We saw large-scale disorder across many of our towns and cities across the United Kingdom. If you think Northern Ireland also suffered, although Scotland didn't, I think, see any disorder. And I think, how do we make sure we maintain the ability to scale up and get a national response to a national critical threat, whilst maintaining and keeping the local ownership and responsibility? Because this weekend, in a town, in a city, there'll be a football match, there'll be some kind of incident. And we saw over the last 2 years a number of incidents that were successfully dealt with locally by good local officers, good local command, with local communities coming together. And I think, the one thing I would say is, how do we make sure we can get a national response, but also make sure the local accountability, through commissioners and mayors, but also the local response, which very often and usually sees a successful and peaceful response for the communities concerned.
John Davis.
Chief Constable Harrington, just in regards to the report, so I won't go into great detail around that, but in terms of making sure that the learning from that report is being embedded across all police forces at your level and down, what role does the National Police Chief Council have around that assurance? And then a similar question to Emily around police and crime commissions, if I may.
Well, first of all, there's the National Police Chiefs Council Coordination Committee, Operations Committee, which I chair, and there is now a National Police Chiefs Council Public Order lead. It was me. The Chief Constable of Gwent has now taken that on from me. So between he and I, working with the MPCC and the National Police Coordination Centre, we're working through each of those recommendations, supported by the College of Policing, and to go through those recommendations and make sure that we perfect the things we think were already good, and to modernise and develop those things where we think we need to improve, and that will be a structured programme of work.
That's with deadlines and timelines, is it?
Yes, working through all those, and many of those things are already in place through our committees. For example, some of the questions around tactics and equipment, there's already an existing working group chaired by a Chief Constable who's looking at the development of tactics and equipment as, of course, the threat changes and new technology comes online.
So through the, obviously, as we said, PCCs will be asking similar questions locally. They'll be reflecting on the HMIC report, identifying the areas that were highlighted within the report. Through the APCC, we have developed a set of resources to try and make sure that some of the issues that have been alluded to, that PCCs know the right questions to ask in terms of what the operational detail is, that not they would direct, but they can ask the questions to make sure they have been thoroughly thought through, and that, as you say, those kind of deadlines and actions are being followed upon.
So who owns it nationally to ensure that all police forces do that by a certain date? Because I've got to say, I was quite astounded by the fact that there's a 19-year-old media protocol that would sound so wanting in a case like this, and it still hasn't been updated. So who's owning this in terms of making sure that it happens and happens with pace and urgency?
From my perspective, I think, and I know we've spoken previously to this committee around the police reform and the work that's going on, and that for me is an example of why I think we need a bit more of a stronger centre to make sure that where you need that consistency and where you need to be able to respond more quickly and pick up some of these issues, that we've got that, which I think we don't quite have it, for all the good work the NPC do. I think we don't quite have that yet. So that's part of the work that I think that I'm hoping the police reform agenda will develop.
And in respect of the recommendations of the HMIC FRS report, that's me as the chair of the National Operations Committee.
Do you think fundamentally this talks to a point that there isn't any national body that holds you guys to account as individual police forces on stuff like this? Because there is clearly and rightly an operational independence, of course, from politicians. But on things like a social media protocol or a media protocol, that isn't necessarily operational. It's just really, really important stuff to get done. I'm using it as an example because you mentioned it in your evidence, Chief Constable. But isn't there something missing here where there isn't that organisation to hold police forces up and down the country feet to the fire on this type of stuff that just needs to be done?
I mean, I come back to the point I made, and I agree. I think that there needs to be accountability around it. But when we look at social media, the threat to social media is beyond policing. You know, you see it there. If you look back into the COVID, you saw that there was the misinformation about vaccines and all those issues. So yes, policing needs to make sure we've got the right response in order to deal with social media and intelligence and gathering evidence and information from that to inform our response, also to bring prosecutions where people break the law in social media, and I think there's examples where we do that. But I think, and I would welcome it certainly as a Chief Constable for a national look at how does social media monitoring take place to ensure we identify the whole range of threats in which policing can deal with those that are applicable to crime.
And I think just to provide that reassurance straight, I mean, in terms of a 19-year-old protocol, it's probably one of those cases with hindsight. It's worked effectively until we get a case like Southport, and as a result of that, the national lead, the NPCC lead for media, working with Gavin Stevens, working with counter-terrorism policing, working with the government and the Crown Prosecution Service, we're all now reviewing what is it we could have done differently. I'm not sure the academic research, the evidence base is out there on how we manage incidents like this with the social media space. We worked incredibly well, both ourselves, Merseyside Police, Counter-Terrorism Policing, National Police Chiefs Council and the Crown Prosecution Service worked incredibly well with the traditional media. The gap is social media, and if you read the academic research, the silver bullets aren't out there yet, and there is a gap, I think, in terms of our understanding on what we do need to do.
Of course, a protocol in itself isn't the silver bullet, but yeah. I don't think it takes a brain surgeon to realise that a protocol which was designed and published before the invention of the iPhone probably was required to be updated by somebody well before 19 years after it's been published. It also links to some very practical points on the ground that's is highlighted in the Constabulary, the Inspectorate's report about lack of water and inconsistency across the country around water for officers on the front line, stories of police officers having to convey themselves to hospital, albeit hopefully unusual, but that was highlighted. And again, in terms of that national the national standards to a local implementation to something that is so important to the trust and confidence that the public have in the police force when things go wrong. Who holds that accountability?
Well, again, in terms of that, and I've read all the debriefs now from the College of Policing for all of the officers deployed, and there were officers injured, we saw, and there were examples, as you say, where officers didn't get everything they needed. One of the things we do in training now is where we deploy officers on mutual aid, to other forces, we deploy a welfare officer, a chief inspector usually, who goes with them in order to make sure their shall we say, pastoral needs are met, like they get their fed and watered and those things. That happens. So we do build that into training. Clearly, when you're mobilising so quickly, when you're moving officers around the country with such speed, that didn't happen on these occasions, but that is part of the training and that is part of the responsibility to do that. We're looking at some of the issues of welfare for officers. I know kit and equipment was mentioned, about overalls and access to toilets and those things. It's an important part of the commanders' training to make sure they can and look after the welfare of their officers, but we will take all of that information and we're working through to say how do we update our tactics and make sure that's even more of an important part of how we ensure the welfare of the staff who do the hard work.
I think just very briefly on Mr Davis's point is there's definitely a role for His Majesty's Inspectorate here in terms of we're talking about national coordination of a response, which sits with the MPCC, and the Chief Constable as chair of the Ops Committee will have the recommendations. But this is an HMIC FRS report, and in the same way we would with any force inspection, we will provide updates as needed to the HMI. So in terms of accountability, that's something that could be factored in as part of a future inspection regime or others, rather than creating something new. So I'm not saying that's the solution, but I think there already exist bodies to hold policing to account, whether that's the PCCs or whether that's the HMI, and then the operational coordination is led by the MPCC.
And I think just to add to that, because obviously a lot of the response, for all that there is national coordination, fundamentally there is a local response, and that's why you've got local PCCs who then are looking at what the difference, what is happening on the ground, because everything that happens nationally always comes back to the local communities, and I think that's what PCCs are trying to do, is to provide that challenge and that accountability, looking at what recommendations are coming out, look at what issues are being raised, and making sure that their force locally is responding to them, is adapting to them, and is making the necessary improvements.
And the issue of an inspectorate, whether it's the Sudbury inspectorate in your case, or the CQC or Ofsted in other areas, it's retrospective. It's a moment in time. It's a window that's inspected. What I'm probably getting into more is what is a systematic approach of accountability to ensure that officers on the front line aren't without water and conveying themselves to a hospital when they're injured. And when you've got a situation where a 90-minute meeting between senior police officers and senior prosecutors is required to issue a press release. So I think that's the challenge I'm trying to provide.
Thank you. I want to thank all four of you for coming, and we have indulged your time a little bit longer than we'd expected, so thank you for that. I think before I finish, I do want to pay tribute to all of those officers who were on the front line. They work, we know that police officers day in day out are putting themselves forward in ways that many people just can't imagine, and we do want to pay tribute to them, and also remember that there were 3 little girls ultimately, and an awful lot of people who were affected by this horrendous incident. So thank you very much for your time. If you can remove yourselves relatively quickly from there, we can then bring our second panel in, which is the Minister. But thank you again for your time. Made a mess.
Thank you.
So obviously you've heard some of the evidence that we've just been listening to, but we have some specific questions for you as the Minister. And if I can start with Paul Kohler.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Dame Diana, I want to pick up something really building on what Sean was saying then. What I wanted to ask Chief Constable Harrington, but I didn't have the time, was he was being too modest, because he succeeded despite the system failing him. He didn't have enough power at the top to call for resources. That slowed down mobilisation. And I'm not still clear how we're going to address that, because I think as Sean made the point, who is asking those questions? What role do you think the government has in that? And is there something missing that we need to insert?
Thank you very much for that question. I'd like to come to that in a moment, but before I do, I did want to say I am very pleased to appear before you today, and I'm really delighted that you are doing this inquiry, because I think parliamentary scrutiny of the events of last summer are really important, sitting alongside the work that the HMIC are doing, reviewing what happened. And I also just wanted to say, echoing really, Dame Karen, what you were just saying at the end of that first session, I wanted to pay tribute to those police officers who were on the front line from the 29th of July, dealing with that horrific incident in Southport. And of course, our thoughts and prayers are still with the victims and the families of that incident. But recognising that those same police officers then, just a few hours later, were then facing the violence and the disorder on the streets. So I just wanted to say that, because I know over 300 police officers were injured during the course of those the summer disorder, and from fractures, bones being broken, fractures to the face, concussion, trauma. I think we recognise what those police officers put up with. And I also think it's worth just reflecting as well that if you look particularly at the Rotherham Hotel incident, I think police officers there saved lives, because that crowd of people were intent on getting into that hotel and causing harm to the asylum seekers there. So I think they saved lives, they put themselves at risk on the front line. And when I spoke to police officers in Humberside and Cleveland, to listen to what their experiences were was humbling. And so I think it's right that what you said, Dame Karen, about the bravery and the courage of those frontline police officers. And then I think I also just wanted to say that I actually agree with what you just said about the system. And I think what struck me as a new minister, we were just 4 weeks into government when this all happened. And I remember that on the 29th, it was our first Home Office orals as the information was coming through from Southport. So we were very new in post, and then obviously from the 29th onwards, this developed. But I think what struck me during the course of those 2 weeks was that there was exceptional leadership and partnership working. And that was in spite of, not because of, the structures that existed. So I think the work that B.J. Harrington, Constable B.J. Harrington, Gavin Stevens as the chair of the MPCC, many other chief constables, they worked incredibly well together, but the structures, I think I would say on behalf of the Home Secretary and myself, we found the structures were not designed for that national response when you're facing disorder at the level that we had. And I think it was really clear that the localised way of policing in this country, the 43 police forces, the chief constables and the PCCs, who I think it's worth just saying are responsible for the totality of policing in their area. When you are then trying to deal with things on a national level, you're absolutely right. Having that ability to hold to account, I think, was a problem. And I think it would also be worth saying I was surprised when the Home Secretary and myself were asking for information about, for example, the number of officers who would be available to be on the streets. There was a little uncertainty about that. They couldn't give us definite answers. And that's because, I think, of the patchwork that happens around the country. So some chief constables would say we could provide X amount, but actually it was Y, it wasn't X. So there was uncertainty. And the Home Secretary, I know, was, and I think B.J. Harrington actually said this in the evidence, that there was a level of intrusion. There was a level of intrusion because the Home Secretary and myself wanted to be reassured that there were sufficient police officers on the streets to deal with the disorder, and the structures that exist couldn't provide that certainty. And I think the Home Office, because of over the last 14 years, that the approach that's been taken to policing, devolving everything down to the local level, I think the Home Office for me felt like it had been hollowed out in terms of being able to hold the ring in terms of what was policing doing. So we were asking lots of questions, and I think the chief constables and the officials were doing their very best, but the structures weren't there to support what we needed, and that's why the Home Secretary has made very clear we need to have this reform agenda for policing to make sure that we have the capabilities that are required. There is the ability to have a national response when required, recognising operational independence of chief constables, but also recognising that the Home Office and ministers want to have a grip. We want to know that police forces are performing, that police forces have the workforces they need, that the capabilities that they require are there. So I think that's kind of my response to your point.
So what are you going to do?
So that's why the Home Secretary set out, we're going to have a white paper this year setting out a reform agenda. And that's about looking at what we need for policing going forward. I think, our policing structures often are from quite a few decades ago. And I just look, for example, at the national aviation capability for policing. You have to have 43 chief constables and 43 PCCs making decisions about a national aviation capability. And I think we'd all probably recognise that's not the most efficient way of doing things, and it's not necessarily the best way of achieving what we want, which is a good capability. So at the moment, that sits with West Yorkshire, and everyone has to agree for changes to be brought forward. So what the Home Secretary is saying, that there are some capabilities we can bring into a national body for policing. That would be an example, aviation, perhaps forensics, perhaps IT, because we recognise that 43 police forces sorting out their own IT systems and buying the licences for each force is not the most efficient way. And we all know and we all accept money is tight, and we have to make sure that every penny we spend is spent well and efficiently. So I think this national policing body is important. I think the Home Office as well. I'm really keen as a minister to have data and performance information. And I'll just tell you this, in December I said to my officials how many police officers had been injured in the riots. And they said to me, well, we can't tell you that, Minister. We'll have to write to 43 police forces to ask them, because we don't hold that information in the Home Office. So another issue that the Home Secretary has set up is a performance unit where we will get data and we will be able to assess what's happening in each police force. And for PCCs, like Emily, having that information that they're able to use then when they hold their own chief constable to account, I think will be very helpful. So it'll help me as a minister, but it'll help the PCC in terms of the accountability.
I asked them about restoring trust in the police. There was a certain degree, well, it's beyond us almost. It's a failure of institutions. But there are issues for the police, particularly in trust as well. How is the government helping the police rebuild trust and confidence in them?
You're absolutely right. Trust and confidence in policing is one of the key parts of our Safer Streets mission. And one aspect of that, an important one, is the neighbourhood policing guarantee. So it's about putting those police officers, PCSOs and specials back into our neighbourhoods, our high streets, our communities. Because we all know as members of Parliament that constituents want to see a police presence. They want to have that reassurance. And it's more than that, isn't it? Because we know that having that neighbourhood policing will often provide the intelligence that then feeds into either, antisocial behaviour, or in some cases, very serious cases, the terrorism threat that might be existing in communities. So I think that neighbourhood policing presence is fundamental to partly dealing with the trust and confidence issue. But there are other things as well, and I'm sure you might want to ask questions about, some of the dreadful cases we've seen in policing, the people who put themselves forward for policing and making sure that we have the best people and that they have, they comply with the highest standards, and where they don't, they are no longer police officers, and having proper mechanisms for getting people out of policing. That's another important part of building trust and confidence.
Going back to the neighbourhood policing, how do you square the circle of having abstractions and needing abstractions but maintaining neighbourhood policing?
And that's obviously a really big issue, and I know as London MPs particularly, you will be concerned about that. And I know Matt Twist would say to me when I've asked him questions about this in the past, that because of London and the number of protests that are held in London, and particularly over the last couple of years, there's been a huge need for officers to be present in central London at weekends for some of the protests. So I fully accept abstraction's a problem, but the neighbourhood policing guarantee is supposed to be about saying we recognise that it's important that neighbourhood officers are in neighbourhoods, and really only in exceptional circumstances would you be abstracting them out of that particular role. And we're working through at the moment how best we can design the system so policing can accommodate that. But you're absolutely right. I'm not pretending it's going to be an easy thing to do, and I fully recognise abstractions are a particular issue in London.
David.
In terms of the cost of that, just obviously to neighbourhoods is obvious, but also the financial cost. So why doesn't the government charge organisations such as football clubs, for example? At the moment, the police do get funding for inside the ground, but not outside the ground. Why doesn't the government look at ways in which to, of course, balance the rights to protest, but where there's repeated protests from the similar organisations that take a disproportionate amount of time, the government give the police the powers to be able to either charge or otherwise manage that demand?
So the Home Secretary has been very clear that she is looking at that. We are currently having discussions, conversations with football in particular, but we've also made it very clear that if those conversations don't result in some clear action and some clear agreements around funding, then we will move to legislate on that issue. So absolutely, I take your point. We need to make sure that we are maximising income because, as we all know, money is very tight.
On repeated protests, the same organisations time and time again, week after week, sort of putting a huge demand on police forces. Of course, they have a right to protest, and that has to be balanced, but there's also a proportionality to that, isn't there?
There is, but I think that is different, and I think protest is a very important part of our constitutional right to express ourselves if we wish to in peaceful protest. So I think that's not something we've looked at because we recognise that people should be able to protest. But you're right that in the last few years, particularly in London, we've seen a lot of protests on a basis of every couple of weeks with some of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign marches.
Margaret Mullane.
Yeah, could I ask, Minister, do you think that, I just asked the Assistant Commissioner about police numbers in the Met, and he said no, he didn't. He kind of said no, he thought everything was all right. When I speak to my local BCU commander, he's pretty much, he welcomes all what we're doing, but he pretty much was saying to me in a meeting about 10 days ago, as many people, he's getting new officers, which is fabulous, but as many are leaving. So do you think a bit like with the abstractions as well, and the two-tier policing question as well, that sometimes the police don't have the honest conversations with the public?
I'm not sure I'd say that the police don't have honest conversations with the public. I think policing is complicated and complex.
Explain themselves more then.
I certainly think there's more that could be done in terms of communications and explanation of what is going on. Yes, I agree with you on that. And I think there have been examples. I go back to actually the protests, the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign protests. I think initially when those protests happened, particularly the Metropolitan Police, I think they were trying to communicate. And I think they would recognise that some of their communications on social media were not in the end very helpful. So I do think, yes, there is more they can do around explanations. I would say on the number of officers, though, with the Met, obviously you will all know that in the past there have been problems with recruitment to the Met. I'm being told now that actually that's no longer an issue in the way it was perhaps a few years ago. And I think that's probably in some part down to the leadership of Sir Mark and the direction that the Met is now taking. They've just come recently out of the Engage process. So I think that's positive. I'm also told that the numbers of police officers leaving is about the average for policing. It's not above the average. I was told that yesterday by the Deputy Commissioner, so I hope that's correct. So I think there are issues clearly about funding with the Metropolitan Police as well, and that is something that we are trying to address and trying to support the Met. But yeah, I think there's probably something in your point about being clearer in communications.
Around.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the points actually from your dialogue with Paul. We heard a lot from the previous panel about the importance of a tailored local response in many instances. Obviously, we've talked about IT, information, aviation, and a drive for more national collaboration. And perhaps national standards and accountability as well. How will the government ensure that drive doesn't undermine the ability of police forces locally in tailoring and seeking a local response to local challenges?
Well, I think the way policing is set up in this country is very much about the operational independence of the chief constables of the forces, and they decide on how they use their resources and the tactics that they employ. But I do think there is a role, as we've already discussed, for ministers and for the Home Office to have more of a grip, really, about making sure that policing is delivering for all of our constituents. And I think the mission that we have, the Safer Streets mission, I think most chief constables recognise the importance of what's within the Safer Streets mission, the neighbourhood policing guarantee, the halving of violence against women and girls over the next decade, the halving of knife crime. These are things that I think there is a common view about that we want to deliver. And of course, for local police forces, they decide how they deliver. One of the things I'm a little concerned about, though, is we know there's best practice. We know there are some police forces that do things really well. And what I don't quite understand is why all police forces are not then adopting and using those tactics. So there is something there about the College of Policing and the role they play in spreading good practice and best practice. And there's also something about the Inspectorate, because they make recommendations. And I think at the last part of the previous panel, there was a discussion about the role for the Inspectorate. Now, if you talk to the Chief Inspector, he will say he would like additional powers because he can make recommendations, but actually police forces don't have to accept them. They don't have to bring them into force. And I know that he's quite keen that as part of the reform agenda, we look at should the Inspectorate have some enforcement powers. So I think there's a range of things there, and this is part of that broader reform of policing and the white paper that will be produced later in the year as to trying to address how you keep that local, as we've talked about, the operational side, but make sure that the capabilities, the holding forces to account, spending money wisely and well, how all of that wraps around that local policing.
Okay, and I suppose in terms of getting a grip, ministers getting a grip particularly, we see in the questioning of Chief Constable Harrington, he said he thought there was an appropriate level of intrusion in terms of the shape and direction of what the response was in terms of the summer disorder. I suppose, has that informed the approach that you and the Home Secretary have taken going forward in terms of balancing considerations around operational independence with the oversight that you need to have confidence?
Well, I think the experience of that period from the 29th of July through to sort of the middle of August was shone a very clear light on where there were gaps and where there were problems and where there were structures that didn't work as effectively as we wanted them to. So I think that was a very steep learning curve as a new policing minister, and it certainly helped me reflect then on the direction we want to take in terms of the police reform agenda. So I think in a way it was a very challenging time, but it was a very instructive time as well for me.
Thank you.
I've just got a couple of questions on the back of that. So the crime and policing bill, the big bill that's been published today, doesn't have any of the new powers for HMIC RFS in it. Is that deliberate?
So this is the first piece of legislation that this Labour government has brought forward, and as you rightly describe, it is a very big bill. The idea is that we've got a white paper that's coming to look at policing reform, and as I've already mentioned, HMIC, there are questions about how HMIC best fits into the new reform landscape, alongside the College of Policing, alongside all these roles that we need to think about and consult on. I think the idea is that in future sessions of Parliament we will be coming forward with legislation if that's what's required. But for now, I think there's probably quite enough in the crime and policing bill to be getting on with.
And you talked about the IT systems, and presumably this is something else for the white paper, but will you be looking not just at common IT systems but also common data collection and having police forces using the same tests for data collection?
Yes, you make a very good point on that, and I'm sure that's probably from your own experience in a previous life. One of the other issues is that often police forces can be capturing data with a definition that they understand, but it's not perhaps a definition that the force next door understands. So it can be quite hard to have data that is, I guess, clean and that we're all on the same page. So yes, part of the work that the Home Office is doing around the performance unit is to have that very clearly defined what it is we're seeking data on in intelligence.
You guessed exactly where my question was coming from.
Yes.
Very much a matter of experience. Just finally on that from me on neighbourhood policing, we do hear from police forces a concern that they won't have the right level of experience and expertise at the neighbourhood level because will they have the experienced officers being able to work with the new officers, bringing in a lot of new officers could mean that you end up with inexperienced officers doing the neighbourhood work. How are you going to make sure that we have police officers who can do neighbourhood policing, which we all support, and in fact in Staffordshire has been, I like to think Staffordshire has been a real forerunner of this, but also that they're the right level of experience?
Well, you're absolutely right on that, and training is important, and so the College of Policing they've been piloting neighbourhood police training, because I think in the past perhaps neighbourhood policing hasn't been seen quite as glamorous as doing firearms or some of the other specialities. So we want to make sure that it's seen and recognised as a very important role in policing. It has the training, and that's why the College of Policing are developing particular training to skill up and to give the knowledge that neighbourhood police officers need in order to deal with some of the issues that we know are so important to our constituents. But you're also right in that I think it's about 40% of policing now has under 5 years experience. So there is a real issue around training and leadership, and I know Sir Mark from the Metropolitan Police will talk about leadership training being so important, and if you look at the training you get in the military for leadership, you get weeks and weeks, if not months, of training. In policing, that's not the case. So again, that goes back to our reform agenda and making sure that the workforce we have has the right skills and training and leadership, because at the moment that's of concern.
Jenny Reid.
Thank you, Minister. You've mentioned in passing the new National Centre of Policing. Are you able to give us any more information about the functions or what exactly that will look like, particularly in relation to public order?
So, broad brush at the moment, because this is going to be very much part of the white paper and the proposals generally around policing. But the Home Secretary has talked about aviation going in there, so as a national capability, forensics, looking at that, IT, the buying of vehicles, of fleet. So those kind of issues initially, but that's to be developed and looked at and consulted on. But we think those are the main ones we could bring together first of all.
So you'll be focusing on kind of supportive functions in the initial...
That's where we're starting from.
Okay. I think you were here when we were discussing the kind of role of social media, particularly in relation to Southport and the subsequent disorder. Has the government done any assessment of, or any kind of systematic analysis of the role that social media played in that disorder? And are there any thoughts around what can be done to deal with this going forward in a more kind of systematic, preventative, as well as dealing with it when crimes are committed online?
One thing I'm sure you're aware of is HMIC are doing their second report, and they're looking at the use of intelligence, which will include obviously social media and how that was used during the disorder. DCIT lead for the government in government departments around relations with social media companies, and I know in the disorder they were having those conversations about some of the content that was being posted. I'm not sure that there's been any overarching review directly on the point that you're making, but what I was quite interested in is that after the disorder in 2011, in the report that was carried out into that, there was a very clear recommendation about the police needing to get to grips with the role of social media and how that was developing. Now, that was in 2011, and I think we'll probably say in 2025 now that there's still much more work to do around social media and how police use it. I did hear what the Chief Constables were saying about the work that was going on with, say, the intelligence agencies around social media, but I think it's one of those areas that we need to do much more on. And I also recognise what the Chief Constables were saying about the need for that local intelligence and the local use of social media, but also bringing it up to that national level when necessary.
So precisely that, they mentioned the kind of national function and looking at it from a national level. So the government hasn't, you're not very far forward in any kind of thinking around a possible national function for monitoring of policing in relation to social media.
We are certainly looking at that, and perhaps Andy, did you want to say anything about this? Because I know that there are conversations with the MPCC and MPOC about this.
Yeah, so I suppose I'd say three things in relation to this. So one is, you've heard both this afternoon and in the evidence session from the chiefs before Christmas about the importance of local capability in terms of monitoring social media. But I think in terms kind of at a more national level, there are two other things that are important. So one is, clearly there needs to be some work looking at automation, because as the chiefs earlier talked about, there are thousands and thousands of posts, and that is clearly not, having police officers spending their time looking at that information is not a particularly effective use of their time when they need to be out on the streets. But then the other part is in relation to the National Police Coordination Centre and the role that they can play, both using the information that they get from forces locally to turn into intelligence packages to inform choices about national deployments, and then also what they can do for more kind of national level events like the ones we saw in the summer. So there's clearly work that we need to do there with NPOC as its acronym is, and as the Minister says, that work is ongoing at the moment, and we'll set out a little bit more in the white paper later in the year.
Davis.
I don't know if this is a question for the Minister or for yourself, Ms Johnson, but in terms of benchmarking us across other countries, I mean, this is a global issue, social media, organisation of crime, misinformation. Have we done any benchmarking across the world about other areas which are further forward on this? And AI is being used as an example of solving lots of problems, but AI does exist already where Parliament itself is using AI in this space. Is that being used and deployed and brought into as a national asset for local police forces to deploy?
Right. Yep. So there is some AI already used. So, for instance, in use of facial recognition, say, so for, there are 20,000 between 20 and 25,000 retrospective searches carried out in police forces every month. That is done by AI, so there is already work in policing in England and Wales looking at that capability. I personally haven't done any benchmarking of kind of capabilities elsewhere, but maybe we can take that back to the department and we can kind of provide you with more information if that will be helpful.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. I wanted to just ask a little bit about political engagement with policing in the UK. So we heard from the previous panel that public order demand is actually now the highest the Met has ever faced. And during the summer disorder, we had to see the police and the CPS and the government working swiftly together. And my ears picked up a bit when you said that as a new minister, you found the Home Office hollowed out in your first couple of months in the role. So I wonder if you can tell us a bit about your reflections as you've started in this role and seeing the demands placed on the government in achieving its priorities and the police forces, and what you think the appropriate role for political oversight of policing should be.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. Perhaps it's worth saying that one of the things that happened after the 29th of July was when the Prime Minister got Chief Constables into Downing Street, sat round the table and basically said to them, right, what do you need? Have you got the resources that you need? We want to make sure that if there are additional costs to whatever it is you need to do, you will be covered. We will provide that money. We will stand up the CPS to make sure that the CPS are there to help police with the charging. We will stand up the courts. So there was that approach of working with the police. It wasn't shouting from the sidelines and saying, you know, what's happening on the streets and why aren't you doing more? It was about the government, the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary saying to policing, we're working with you on this. What can we do to support you? And you will know as well that the Prime Minister talked at that meeting about this National Violent Disorder Programme, and that's standing that up. So I think that was very much he set the tone along with the Home Secretary of, we want to work with you. This has to be a partnership. And I think for me that's kind of just was very clear then the direction we were going in. That wasn't to say that the Home Secretary then wasn't very searching at times with senior police officers about what was actually happening, whether there were sufficient cops on the street, whether we could be reassured of that. So I think the tone, and also moving on to the reform agenda, the tone is very much about we want to work with policing. So respecting the roles that operational policing have, but making sure the resources are there and that we are supporting police officers. So that's the kind of approach that we're taking. I think throughout the period of disorder, politically, it was quite important that we were having conversations with PCCs, so I certainly had calls with them. I also had calls with members of Parliament. I was very conscious there were a lot of new members of Parliament in areas where there was disorder. And, 4 weeks in as a minister, 4 weeks in as a new MP, and you've got your streets seeing the level of violence in some cases that happened, could be really difficult. So we wanted to make sure that MPs felt supported. We also had calls with the House of Lords as well, because we knew a number of peers were very concerned about what was happening. I had calls, I remember I think it was the 10th of August, it was when the football season was about to start. I'm not a great football fan, I have to say, but I was really concerned that we were suddenly going to be launched into the football season. We'd had this period of disorder, and the two coming together could have been very difficult. So I remember having a phone call with the national the national lead for football and hooliganism, who was remarkably, I have to say, remarkably calm. He'd obviously, done football policing for a very long time. He was very reassuring. But I was asking him quite searching questions, and I think that was appropriate to make sure that, policing was ready in case things happen that particular weekend. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but it was about being supportive but challenging, and also working with the PCCs as well, because they obviously held their chief constables to account.
Thank you, Minister, for that. Can I ask one follow-up on it, which is, has that analysis, has that reflection of the period of the disorder, does that apply only to public order policing, or do you think will you apply those lessons more broadly to the whole gamut of policing? And then if I could also ask, we've talked about trust and public support. One of the issues, you talked about this in your answer there, was the Prime Minister and yourselves being very clear with the public, we're going to be standing up here, which of course I completely support. But the speed with which the sort of prosecutions took place, the perceived harshness of some of the sentences, do you think that's had any negative consequences for public perception of trust, either for people feeling singled out or for people feeling other types of policing, other types of prosecutions don't get the same attention?
Well, on to your first point, I think although my reflections were around public order and the protest, the criminal behaviour, it wasn't protest, it was criminal behaviour. I think we could probably apply what happened in the summer more generally in terms of the structures around policing, what I was saying about the fact that we have some exemplary leaders in policing, and it's because of that, rather than it's because we have that exemplary leadership in policing rather than because of the structures that don't work terribly well that we were able to get through in the summer. I think that can be applied to other areas as well. And I'm thinking particularly around violence against women and girls, and what we're saying about halving knife crime. The structures around that, we are looking at and are asking and questioning, and policing are as well, whether this will deliver what we want to achieve, or do we have to change the structures that we have. And I think it's your second point about the speed of the justice. I absolutely think what happened in the summer and the speed of those people who were out on our streets throwing bricks and petrol bombs at police officers and attempting to get into asylum hotels and hurt people. I think it was absolutely right that there was swift justice, and that people became very clear there were consequences. If you break the law, there are consequences. And one thing that just always struck in my mind was in my own city of Hull, there was looting that went on during the criminal disorder in the town, in the city centre, and there were young women who went into Lush in the centre of Hull, didn't cover their faces. They went into Lush and they were coming out with armfuls of toiletries and the Lush boxes. Like, this was completely acceptable behaviour, that you go into somewhere like that and you steal and nothing's going to happen to you. And I think so. For that looting, but also the violent disorder that we saw, absolutely, I think that the swift justice was the appropriate thing to do. We cannot as a government have our streets in that level of criminal disorder. You can't have that. So it was right what happened. But you're also correct in that it shows very starkly there, for example, on rape cases where women particularly are waiting years to get to court to have their cases heard. And that cannot be right either. And I think, I feel very strongly that we had to do what we did in the summer, but by goodness, we've got to sort out these delays for everyone else to get justice. That is absolutely, and I will be political here, that is a failure of previous governments, the reduction that we've seen in the courts, in the cuts to CPS, etc., etc. So I think we've got to get that right.
Thank you for that. If I could come on to another question about the impact of disorder on other policing priorities. So, the Chair referred earlier on to the issue around neighbourhood policing and inexperienced officers being moved around. You referred yourself to the football season coming straight after the summer disorder. Do you recognise that many police officers in the country feel very overstretched and not properly backed up to deal with the challenges that we're facing across multiple fronts? And do you have concerns about, you mentioned retention in the Met, but more broadly, retention of police officers with experience?
Yeah, I think well-being and looking after our police officers is something that I am very conscious of, and reading the HMIC report and what the inspectorates say in there about looking after those officers from last summer and what they had to put up with. And I heard earlier the questions about, not having water, not having food, some of the equipment not really being quite right in terms of the overalls that police officers were wearing at that level 2 public order, what they were wearing and whether actually an overall is the most appropriate thing. And when I was at Gravesend, actually, I was talking to a woman police officer wearing the overalls, and I said, "Oh, are those designed? Are they unisex?" And they were unisex. And we all know that women's bodies are different to men's bodies, and so it seems to me there's a whole piece of work there to do about making sure that officers have the right equipment and they are well supported when they're out on the front line. So absolutely well-being is an issue, and we have the police covenant, and I chaired the first one we've had in this government, the National Covenant Board before Christmas, and there is so much more to do on this. We know that police forces and chief constables are responsible. They are the ones who have to make sure their officers are properly looked after and there's proper occupational health. But there is much more we can do. Absolutely. That's something I'm very conscious of.
Davis.
One of the things the government absolutely can do is ensure that funding is made available, particularly when there's these types of unprecedented demands. And we heard from the Chief Constables earlier that a letter of comfort was provided to police forces, and they planned on that basis that funding would be reimbursed. Minister, could you just update the committee in terms of where they are in terms of that reimbursement? Because we've heard from different police chief constables that the financial gap that they are carrying forward is unsustainable. Sort of putting to one side the other challenges around national insurance and so forth.
So that work is ongoing about exactly what money needs to be reimbursed to police forces, but that work hasn't been completed yet, to be very upfront about it. You will know the police settlement was announced at the end of January, and there is additional money going in to the police from April. There's up to 1.1 billion extra. There's that additional money around the neighbourhood policing to really kickstart that, because we recognise how important it is. But funding is a problem, and we've inherited a situation where we are having to be very careful with money across government. I think it's fair to say the Home Secretary bats very hard for policing to make sure we get the resources that are required, but it is tough.
The commitment was made to reimburse the costs to police forces, and they planned on that basis. Is it something that you're pushing Treasury to sort of fund from a special reserve on the basis that it was a special set of circumstances that none of us could have predicted or planned for financially?
So we are looking at that. Please rest assured that is being looked at, absolutely.
One final question on this and then a couple more issues, if that's okay. Is there anything with hindsight that you would have done differently?
Well, I think it's been recognised by HMIC, and also I think I heard BJ Harrington say this as well. The national mobilisation was later than it should have been, and I think that's acknowledged. So I think that with hindsight, and that's obviously now several months on, I think that's the main thing that really stands out. I mean, there was clearly mutual aid going on between forces. Operation Yvette was set up. I think that's the one thing, the national mobilisation being too late, and I think there is just generally a recognition that was the case.
Very quickly on vetting, so the Home Secretary made some comments this morning about the Home Office is moving at pace, I quote, to bring forward new vetting regulations following the case. What pace is that?
Very, very quickly.
Not snails then?
Not snail's pace at all. And last October, the Home Secretary talked about those new vetting regulations that needed to be brought forward. They had to be consulted on. The consultation, I think, closed about 2 weeks ago. And I think the civil servants are under no illusion that both the Home Secretary and myself are absolutely determined that we need to get these regulations in. We cannot have officers who can't hold their vetting serving as police officers. So we are moving very much, I mean, I hate that expression, moving at pace, but we are moving very, very quickly on this.
Thank you. And there have been obstacles, and I think the Met Commissioner has referred to there being obstacles. Mr Johnson, can I perhaps turn to you? Is there any insight you can give us to what those obstacles were or are?
Well, I think I think at the time, these are complicated regulations, and I think at the time there was work being the focus was on regulations in relation to legally qualified chairs and replacing those with chief constables, and I think that was the priority at the time. But work was still going on in the background, looking at the issue about vetting. Maybe, as the Minister said, with hindsight, maybe that could have been, we could have done something differently. But these are complicated matters, and there's a consultation process that needs to be worked through. But as the Minister says, we're all kind of seized of the need to do this quickly.
Perhaps I can say this because I don't think Mr Johnson can. But this issue has been kicking around for a while. It should have been dealt with a long time ago. This is something that previous governments who made commitments about, particularly after the cases in the Met, the Sarah Everard case particular, they said they were going to do things and they should have done them and they didn't. So I think I'm able to say that as a minister. Previous ministers should have dealt with this, but we are now going to deal with it quickly.
Thank you. And then final question is around police pensions, the McLeod judgment. We've had a lot of representations to the committee about this. What assurances can you offer to those retired police officers who are suffering financially at the moment and really just need to see I think it's a remedial service statement?
So I'm having deja vu because in the very last hearing as the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee in the previous Parliament, we had this very issue in front of us. And I know it's a real concern to police officers. They want to get this statement. We know that the assurance has been given that those statements will be provided by April. I think that was the agreement. And I'm told, I've asked specifically, and I'm told that is going to happen. So that's the assurance that I've been given. But I know it is of concern to people.
Thank you. We will work on the basis of assurance by April. That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and coming before us today. Your first time back.
Thank you.
But thank you very much for that. And this concludes the evidence that we're taking on this particular inquiry. Order.